I was asked to talk about the legacy of Rowntree, and I've assumed, perhaps not with a great deal of justification, that we're talking about Seaborn Rowntree rather than Joseph Rowntree. And I only discovered from looking at the slides earlier that we're going through there that Joseph's father was Joseph and Seaborn's grandfather. So I'm going to be focusing mainly on Seaborn, and I'm going to say something about the 1899 study of poverty that he undertook. I'm going to say a bit about the impact of his work on policy, on thinking, and on social science generally. And then I'm going to make some remarks about his relevance to today's work on poverty. And then I'm going to break away from the historical perspective and talk about poverty in York and whether York is typical in terms of its poverty and inequality. I'm going to conclude that it isn't typical any longer, even if it was. But I'm finishing up by saying that we actually don't know enough about poverty and inequality at a local level, and this is a gap, and we ought to be doing something about it. And I do appreciate that there are very many people in this audience who know a great deal more than I do about Seaborn Rowntree and about York, and indeed about poverty. So I hope that I don't spend too much time teaching my grandfathers to suck eggs. Well, here's Benjamin Seaborn Rowntree. We've got a Seaborn Rowntree building at the university with a cabinet full of artefacts of Seaborn Rowntree, including his bust, which is absolutely ghastly to behold. It was donated to us by the Joseph Rowntree Foundation because they didn't want it in their offices any longer. But there are also copies of his many books and pamphlets, including first editions of his 1901 survey. Poverty, a Study of Town Life, was published in 1901 when we celebrated the centenary. The charitable trust funded the production of a facsimile edition published by the Policy Press, which is still in print if you'd like to obtain a copy. There are a number of facsimile editions of this book available actually, but this is the only one that's got the maps in it, so it's the best. Well, a bit about Seaborn, the man. He was the son of Joseph and the grandson of Joseph. He was a Quaker, political liberal, and he did his the first survey of poverty in York when he was 28 years old. He'd studied food chemistry at Manchester University and read about nutrition, and he was motivated by reading Booth's surveys of poverty in London, and he sought to see whether the things that Booth had described in London were true of his home city in York. He undertook his survey in 1899. I think it took 6 to 9 months to collect the data, and he set out to collect data on 46,754 people in 11,500 working class households. And he defined the working class as anybody who didn't have servants. His questionnaire was incredibly short, and he only collected a very limited amount of data from his households. There wasn't an income schedule in his survey because he collected the wages data mainly from employers, including his own father's chocolate factory, and apparently the employers gave up this information very easily. And he, of course, there were no benefits then, so he didn't have to collect any data on benefits. No one with these incomes was paying any tax, so the wages were basically the income that the people were receiving. And remarkably, and Peter Kane-Cordell has written a paper about this, he only had one person to help him collect this data, going from house to house. And Peter Kane-Cordell thinks it's impossible that he could have collected all this data with just one person, and suspects he made quite a lot of the data up. It wasn't just an empirical study, it was also tremendously innovative in terms of its concepts and its findings. And the principal innovation that Rowntree used was the idea of a poverty threshold based on a basket of goods consisting of the minimum necessities for the maintenance of merely physical efficiency. And he priced this basket of goods. The food elements were pretty carefully specified. The clothing, housing and fuel elements were very roughly specified, and he assessed whether households had incomes which enabled them to live above this basket of goods threshold, budget standard. And he distinguished between two levels of poverty: primary poverty, which was people who just couldn't afford the budget, and secondary poverty. Poverty was people who weren't living at the standard of the poverty threshold because they were spending money on things that weren't included in the budget, either useful or useless. So it's not true that it was just people who were spending money on drink and tobacco who were in secondary poverty. There were lots of things that people were spending money on which were useful, but they meant that they were living in poverty. And these proportions, 9.9%, is really quite a familiar statistic. We just heard that the child poverty rate in York is about that now, using a very different threshold, of course. And his findings were that the principal explanation for primary poverty were low wages, including the low wages paid in his father's chocolate factory. Secondly, large families. Thirdly, the death of a breadwinner. Fourthly, incapacity. And unemployment. And underemployment was a very small problem. And these findings were terribly important. They shot down a general set of beliefs about the causes of poverty that had existed up to that period. And the other famous insight of Rowntree's was that poverty was an experience with a life cycle to it. 5 successive periods of life when the risk of poverty was high and low depending on the age structure of the population, with childhood and old age being the principal periods of highest risk, and the working life being the period of lowest risk. This is still, of course, true. Well, a bit about the impact of Rowntree. Some people claim that he was the first empirical social scientist in Britain. He was I think he was certainly the first person to go beyond description, to introduce analysis into an investigation. Booth's study of London had been very influential, but it was very descriptive in comparison with the kind of analysis that Rowntree attempted. And it had a remarkable impact on research and social science, really right up until the 1950s in this country. And I suppose it was the foundation of the British empirical tradition of social science. It's a remarkable book, just as in itself. It's presented excellently. The writing is very clear. It's full of easy-to-read tables, charts, famous map, which has the location of every single pub in York on it, with a red dot, and students of social policy used in their first year, in Freshers' Week, take the map and go to certain parts of York and see if they could rediscover the pubs that still existed, whether they still existed or not, and to sample their beers. It has case studies, evocative case studies, descriptions of the lives of people. It has chapters, separate chapters on housing and poverty, health and poverty, and includes some spatial analysis of the heights and weights of school children in primary schools in York, and it has an appendix chapter on education provision. The style of the writing is, I think, remarkably humane for the period. Certainly there are judgments in it, but it kind of avoids much moralizing about the behaviours of the poor. And as John Bright Wilson has written in an essay, he's written about Rowntree's primary poverty line. He wasn't actually advocating that anybody should live on this poverty line, and he went out of his way to say it's actually impossible to live on this poverty line. He was using it as what John calls a heuristic device to convince people that the numbers that he was coming up with were actually real, reliable and valid assessments of the prevalence of poverty. And in his main findings, poverty was the result of low wages. He was, of course, really for the first time asserting that poverty wasn't the fault of the poor, and that the distinctions that were then being made all the time about the distinction between the deserving and undeserving poor were nonsense. And it was a direct assault on the ideology of the existing poor law and of the dominant views of the Charity Organisation Society and its views about poverty being due to the behaviour of the poor. Remarkably, Rowntree didn't make any recommendations about what should happen as a result of his findings. He merely said that something must be done. It wasn't good enough. But it had a very big impact on policymakers, in particular on Lloyd George and Winston Churchill. Winston Churchill made a speech in Liverpool in 1902 and waved a copy of the book to his audience. "I've been reading a book which has fairly made my hair stand on end." And of course, in 1905, Churchill crossed the floor of the House of Commons to join the Liberals and became very active in the Liberal government that introduced the first reforms that led to the welfare state. There's some doubt about what impact the Rowntree study had on the Royal Commission on the Poor Law. The Webbs came to tea in York, and so they visited Rowntree, but his work's not referred to, I don't think, in the Royal Commission, minority or majority report, and I'm not sure whether his work influenced either. But I think we can trace influences to the Liberal government reforms. His second study of poverty in York in 1936 was terribly influential, of course, in setting the scale rates of benefits that Beveridge recommended in his report in 1942. And his third study of poverty in York, which was the only one to use sampling techniques, was responsible for probably the eradication of poverty myth, which took until the mid-1960s to overcome. What about his relevance today? One should claim that the Joseph Rowntree Foundation and the other two Rowntree trusts are a remarkable inheritance for us, funding very generously research on poverty, place and ageing up to today. The Joseph Rowntree Foundation is a major landlord in York and social care provider, and so they're a tremendous asset, not just to York, but also to social science. The spirit of Rowntree, I think, exists in York, and the city seems still to be preoccupied with the kind of concerns that Rowntree had. Recently, there's been a Fairness Commission in York, which has produced an excellent report, and there's a move afoot now for a number of major employers in York to introduce a living wage, which is going to be the subject of an evaluation, we hope. We are still studying poverty in similar ways to Rowntree, using thresholds. Budget standards have even been reintroduced. Budget standards went out of fashion after the Second World War, but they were reintroduced as a way of establishing poverty thresholds, and living standards thresholds in the 1980s, and the Joseph Rowntree Foundation has been funding a big project, the Minimum Income Standards Project, now based at the University of Loughborough, which is still publishing budget standards and has been mainly responsible for setting the living wage, which is getting increasing attention around the country. We still study poverty using household surveys, and we have copied or learned from Rowntree about how to present data on poverty in an accessible way. The same kinds of analysis are still being done on the prevalence and causes of poverty and the consequences of poverty, separating those things out in stark contrast to the absolutely dreadful consultation on the measurement of child poverty that's just been issued by the government, or just been finished by the government, which muddles up all these things and wants to put them in the same index. We are still arguing about whether the poor are responsible for their poverty or not. Ian Duncan Smith is convinced that poverty, child poverty, is seems to be convinced is primarily caused by drugs and improvidence, and restricted to 120,000 problem families. Adrian Sinfield sent me this lovely quote from R.H. Tawney. "Improve the character of individuals by all means, if you feel competent to do so, especially of those whose excessive incomes expose them to particular temptations." Low wages are still a major cause of poverty. 60% of poor children are living in poverty because their parents don't earn enough to lift them above the poverty threshold, and low wages have become an increasingly important cause of poverty over the last 10 decades. and poverty is still the result of low wages and inadequate or non-existent social benefits. Of course, there have been many advances since 1901 in concepts, the introduction of relative concepts of poverty in the work of Peter Townsend, broader conceptions of resources than Rowntree considered. We don't just study rates of poverty now, we also use measures like poverty gaps, how far people are below poverty thresholds. And there have been advances in method. In 1899, Rowntree didn't know anything about sampling, it hadn't been invented. In 1936, sampling had been invented, but he didn't believe it. And so he did another population survey and then compared his results with a sample of 10%, and that convinced him that sampling was scientifically okay, and he used it in 1955. And we use equivalence scales, and deprivation indicators have been introduced into the discourse, and we study persistence of poverty in a way that he didn't. So I'm not saying it's all exactly the same. Things have advanced, but he's still very influential. Now, the second part of my talk, this is where I move to York now. There are moves afoot in the sociology department at the University of York to establish York as a social science laboratory. And Rowntree said, having satisfied myself that the conditions of life obtaining in my native city of York were not exceptional, and it might not be taken as very representative of the conditions existing in many, if not most of our provincial towns, the question has arisen, is York typical? Can it be used as a social science lab for the country, not just provincial towns? Now, when we celebrated the centenary of the publication of Poverty, a Study of Town Life, we tried to persuade the Joseph Rowntree Foundation to do another survey of poverty 100 years after, and they didn't support us. And I don't think there has been any surveys of poverty in York after 1955. Someone might want to correct me, but I did a study when I came to York as a postgraduate student in 1967 of a small sample, 300 over 80s. And I was thinking about it last night. This was a study done in 1967-68, and they must have been, and they were over 80s then, and they must have been the children of Rowntree's sample in 1899. And the principal finding of that study is quite interesting. Their living standards were terribly low. Their incomes were terribly low, the over 80s. Hardly any of them had occupational pensions. They were basically all living on the state retirement pension, and the state retirement pension in the 1960s was terribly low, and some of them were claiming national assistance. Actually, it must have been supplementary benefits by then, but most of them hadn't claimed, and there was no housing benefit then, and but the remarkable thing about them was they said, we are better off in real terms in retirement at the age of 80 than we have ever been in the whole of our lives. And it's probably true. They were living in York in 1899 as children. They were adults in the 20s and 30s, high levels of unemployment, and kind of retired before the end of the Second World War, and the pension was the best they'd ever had. Interesting. But there were some follow-up studies of some of Rowntree's samples or samples of some of Rowntree's respondents, the descendants, Atkinson, Maynard and Trinder and Roy Cahill, did some follow-up studies. Instead of doing a survey, in 1999, we published a report, or the Joseph Rowntree Foundation published a report, which was a kind of review of all the evidence on living standards in York at that time. And we concluded that at the end of the 1990s, York might still be regarded as fairly representative of a provincial town. And since then, there has been the York Fairness Commission, which I've already mentioned, which has collected together quite a lot of jolly good analysis of the circumstances of people in York. And we have got the census to draw on. The 2011 census finds that York has grown since 2001 by 9%, and particularly 20 to 24-year-olds and over 85s have grown. York looks and feels unusually monochrome in terms of ethnicity, and the census shows that 8.8% weren't white British, and 5.5% were born outside the EU, and Gary Craig, who's here, has argued that we neglect the growing ethnic mix of York. Students have become a very important part of the population of York, and most students are pretty poor, actually. The evening press was, York Evening Press was surprised to learn recently that the Office of National Statistics had York as a town with one of the lowest fertility rates of any local authority in the country. And of course this is due to the very large fecund female population who are delaying their childbirth because they're undergraduate or postgraduate students. York's population is very highly qualified. It comes 13th out of all local authorities in the league table nationally. And I couldn't find anything else particular about York from the 2011 census. It seems from that fairly typical. We have, the census can be used to undertake spatial analysis of living standards. This is work we did using 2001 census data for the York crime audit. These are enumeration districts, I think, rather than output areas. And it's using the Breadline Britain Index, which is a census-based index based on 5 or 6 questions in the census, which have something to do with material living standards. And this is a distribution with the darker areas being the being poorer than the lighter areas, and we use this data to see whether crime was associated with living standards. So the census can be used, but it has rather limited use because it doesn't collect any data on income. More useful, I think, for local analysis is the development of the index of deprivation, and these are the York results for the index of deprivation. This is where York comes in the national quintile distribution, and the poorest quintile is at the bottom. All right, thanks. Yes, the poorest quintile is at the bottom there, and you see that there are fewer people in York in the poorest quintile. The different 10. The next one is Idaki, that's the child poverty index. The next one is the old people's poverty index. And then you've got the different domains: income, employment, health, education, housing, crime, and environment. The only domain where York does look as if it's more deprived than nationally is in terms of crime, which is a quite surprising finding, as the population of York thinks that it's a low crime area, and it needs further investigation, I think. Also, we don't do terribly well on environment. That's because we're a city and environment is much better in the countryside. But it's quite clear that we are not typical we're rather rich, in fact. 40% of the population are living in the top quintile of lower level super output areas in the national distribution. This is a picture of lots of change over time between the 2000 index of deprivation and the 2010 index of deprivation, and it shows that most lower level super output areas improved in terms of the national distribution in York during that period, and actually, quite interestingly, it improved more in the richer areas than in the poorer areas, which may be significant in terms of trends in inequality in York. We have developed, using the same techniques as the index of deprivation, a child well-being distribution, and this is the York picture, the decile distribution of child well-being, with the darker areas indicating lower child well-being, and you can identify, those of you who are York residents, where children have problems in York. That's Town Hall, that's Water Lane, Clifton, that's Acomb, somewhere up there is Strensall, which has also got serious problems for a village outside York. This kind of analysis is very useful, but it has its limitations. I think my conclusion from that data is that York is now probably not typical of the nation, not typical of provincial cities. In fact, it's probably rather rich. However, it nevertheless has its problems. And this slide is just a summary of some of these problems. The York Credit Union is just closed and the food bank has opened. And every loan shark in the country has an office, has a shop in York high streets. Atos is reassessing employment support allowance as we speak, turfing people off incapacity benefit, and the Welfare Benefits Unit at York has, over the last 5 years, been helping people who are appealing against these decisions by Atos, and has won back for these claimants over £1 million in lost benefit. They've also been running a campaign for the last year to increase the take-up of disabled living allowance by disabled children in York, and they have, in a year, encouraged parents to apply for DLA, totalling £300,000. So there's a lot of non-take-up and unmet need. I think it's pretty certain that York's still a low-wage city. It's certainly below average in earnings in the national distribution, and some work we've done in developing the proposal for research on the introduction of the living wage has identified hundreds of people living, working for less than the minimum wage, and thousands of people, hundreds living below the minimum wage and thousands living below the living wage. And it's going to be quite expensive for those employers who are going to be introducing the living wage to meet that aspiration. York has got high house prices nationally, so it suffers from that. And we know from benefit and tax credit claiming statistics that there were 17,600 children on child tax credits because their wages were too low, their own incomes were too low in 2012, and only 4,800 of them were on child tax credit because they're out of work. So 13,000 low-wage earners were claiming, children were in households receiving supplements to their earnings. And we know from benefit statistics that there were 24,400 households, benefit units, receiving means-tested benefits and tax credits early in 2012. That's 29% of all households in York were living on an income which was means-tested. Out-of-work benefits, pensions, credits, and tax credits. And now, in April, most of those who aren't pensioners are being expected to pay 20% of their council tax by the transfer of responsibility for council tax to the local authority. York has decided to charge people on out-of-work benefits 20% council tax. And here are the numbers of different people on different benefits. Job seekers allowance, 3,600. Employment support allowance, 5,000. Lone parents, 1,000. Carers, pension credit, 6,000 pensioners in York receiving pension credit, and 7,000 in work on child tax credit. So this is my final slide, and it's about data on poverty and inequality in York. And it asks the question, is there a gap in our local data on poverty and inequality? In the absence of a survey, of a sample survey, can we really, is there really enough information about poverty and inequality at local level? I refer you to the York Fairness Commission's report, which did the best it could to draw data together, and the York Child Poverty Needs Assessment, which is carried out by the local authority every year. It's a very, very helpful source of local data. But the vast majority of the data presented in those reports is spatial data on small areas. And we don't really have any data on individual household level experiences of poverty and inequality. And I think we really should have such a resource at a local level. And I conclude with just one measure of inequality in York, one observation. My net income before I retired was £872 a week. A lone parent with one child in York has to survive on £133 per week. That's a measure, one measure, of the inequality in this city.